The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle, as Guardsman Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he thought would be another routine day. Standing at attention outside the castle gates, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned, Thomas had performed this duty countless times over his 3 years of service. The tourists would come, take their photos, and try their best to make him smile or move. He had mastered the art of remaining perfectly still, a living statue in service to the crown. But this particular Tuesday morning would be different. Among the usual crowd of visitors, a small figure caught his attention from the corner of his eye. A young boy, no more than 8 years old, sat in a wheelchair, pushed by what appeared to be his grandmother. The child wore a miniature military uniform, complete with tiny medals pinned to his chest. His face was pale and thin, but his eyes sparkled with excitement as he gazed up at the towering guard. The grandmother wheeled the boy closer to Thomas's post. She whispered something to the child, who nodded eagerly. With trembling hands, the boy raised his small arm in a perfect military salute. His grandmother explained in a soft voice that her grandson, Jamie, had been battling leukemia for 2 years. Despite his illness, Jamie dreamed of becoming a soldier like the Queen's Guard. He had been saving his allowance for months to buy the uniform he wore, wanting to look proper when he met a real guardsman. Thomas felt his heart tighten in his chest. The rules were clear. Guards must remain motionless and expressionless during their duty. Breaking protocol could result in serious disciplinary action. But as he looked down at Jamie's determined salute, something stirred within him that was stronger than regulations. The boy's arm was beginning to shake from the effort of holding the salute, yet he refused to lower it. Waiting for acknowledgement from his hero, for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Thomas wrestled with his duty and his humanity. The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing something special was happening. Parents pulled their children closer to witness what might unfold. Cameras were lowered as people realized they were witnessing something more important than a typical tourist photo opportunity. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, Thomas began to move. His right hand, white-gloved and steady, slowly rose from his side. The movement was deliberate and precise, executed with all the military bearing his training had instilled in him. As his hand reached his temple, completing the return salute, a collective gasp rose from the crowd. Jamie's face lit up with a smile so brilliant it seemed to outshine the morning sun. The salute lasted only a few seconds, but its impact would last a lifetime. Thomas held the boy's gaze as he slowly lowered his hand, offering the slightest nod of respect. Jamie finally lowered his own trembling arm, tears of joy streaming down his cheeks. His grandmother dabbed at her own eyes with a handkerchief, mouthing thank you to the guard who had just made her grandson's dream come true. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. But Thomas had already returned to his stoic position, eyes forward, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Word of the touching exchange spread quickly through social media, with several visitors sharing videos of the moment. Within hours, the story had reached news outlets across the country and eventually around the world. The royal family themselves took notice of Thomas's compassionate act. Rather than facing disciplinary action, he received a commendation for showing the human face of the monarchy. The palace issued a statement praising his actions as representing the very best of British military tradition, strength tempered with compassion. Jamie's condition continued to improve in the following months, and he often spoke of that magical morning when a Queen's Guard saluted him back. His grandmother framed a photo from that day, showing the moment when 2 soldiers, separated by age, experience, and circumstance, connected through a simple gesture of mutual respect. It became Jamie's most treasured possession. Inspiring him through his ongoing treatment and recovery, Thomas continued his service with renewed purpose. Knowing that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons or strategy, but with simple human kindness, he carried with him the memory of a brave little boy whose courage in the face of illness reminded him why he had chosen to serve in the first place. The silent salute had spoken louder than any words ever could. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of Buckingham Palace as Guardsman Sarah Collins prepared for her shift, It was a dreary October afternoon, the kind that sent most tourists scurrying for shelter in nearby cafes. She welcomed the quieter days, though she would never admit it aloud. The constant attention from visitors could be overwhelming, especially when they tested her resolve with jokes, questions, and attempts to break her composure. As Sarah took her position outside the palace gates, she noticed an elderly woman standing alone across the street, unlike the usual tourists who hurried past in the rain. This woman remained perfectly still, seemingly oblivious to the water dripping from her gray hair. She wore a simple black coat and clutched a small bouquet of white roses. Her eyes were fixed on the palace with an intensity that caught Sarah's attention. Hours passed, and the woman remained in the same spot. Other guards had rotated through their shifts, but the mysterious figure never moved. Sarah began to worry about the elderly woman's well-being. The temperature was dropping, and hypothermia was a real concern for someone her age, standing motionless in the rain for so long. During a brief moment when no other tourists were around, Sarah noticed the woman slowly approaching the palace gates. She moved with careful, deliberate steps, as if each one required considerable effort. When she reached the iron bars, she placed her weathered hand on the metal and began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Thompson, age 78. She explained that 60 years ago she had worked as a seamstress in the palace, helping to create gowns for royal events. It was there she met James, a young gardener who tended to the palace grounds. They fell deeply in love among the rose gardens and marble corridors of the royal residence. James had proposed to Margaret in the palace gardens during his lunch break on a spring day in 1963. They planned to marry the following summer, dreaming of a small ceremony followed by a life together filled with the beauty they had found within the palace walls. James would continue his work with the gardens, while Margaret pursued her passion for fashion design. Everything seemed perfect in their young lives. But fate had other plans. James was called to serve in a military conflict overseas just months before their planned wedding. He promised Margaret he would return in time for their ceremony, and she spent her days creating the most beautiful wedding dress she had ever designed. Working by candlelight in her small apartment after her palace duties ended each day, the telegram arrived on what should have been their wedding day. James had been killed in action 3 days earlier. Margaret's world collapsed in an instant. She could never bring herself to wear the wedding dress she had crafted with such love and hope. Instead, she packed it away and left London, unable to bear the memories that surrounded her in every corner of the city. For 60 years, Margaret had avoided returning to the palace. But as her own health began to fail, she felt drawn back to the place where she had experienced the greatest love and deepest loss of her life. She wanted to honor James's memory by visiting the spot where he had proposed. To finally say the goodbye she never had the chance to say. As Margaret finished her story, Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes. The elderly woman reached into her coat and pulled out the small bouquet of white roses she had been carrying. They were the same type of roses that grew in the palace gardens where James had proposed all those decades ago. Margaret had planned to leave them at the gates and return home to spend her final months in peace. Without hesitation, Sarah made a decision that went against every regulation she had learned during her training. She stepped away from her post and opened the gate, gesturing for Margaret to enter. The old woman looked confused and frightened, certain she would be arrested for trespassing on royal property. But Sarah's gentle smile reassured her that this was an act of compassion. Not a trap, Sarah escorted Margaret through the gardens, helping her navigate the paths that had changed significantly over the decades. When they reached the rose garden, where James had proposed, Margaret knelt slowly and placed her bouquet among the blooming flowers. She whispered words of love and forgiveness, finally releasing the grief she had carried for 60 years. The moment was witnessed by several palace staff members who had gathered quietly at a respectful distance. No one reported Sarah's breach of protocol. Instead, they understood they had witnessed something sacred, a love story finding its conclusion in the very place it had begun. Margaret returned home that evening transformed. The burden of unresolved grief had been lifted from her shoulders. She lived for 3 more peaceful months, often speaking of the kind guard who had helped her find closure. When she passed away, she left instructions for her ashes to be scattered in the public gardens near the palace. Where she could rest eternally close to her beloved James, Sarah continued her service. With a deeper understanding of why the monarchy mattered to so many people, the palaces and ceremonies were not just symbols of power, but repositories of human stories, dreams, and memories that connected generations across time. The first snowfall of winter blanketed London in pristine white as Guardsman David Reynolds began his morning shift at St. James's Palace. The cold bit through his uniform, but years of training had taught him to ignore physical discomfort. What he could not ignore, however, was the frail figure of an old man who had been visiting the same spot outside the palace gates every day for the past 2 weeks. The man appeared to be in his late 80s, always impeccably dressed in a worn but well-maintained military uniform from decades past. His medals caught the light as he stood at attention. Mirroring David's own posture with remarkable precision for someone his age, each day he would arrive at precisely 9 in the morning and remain standing until noon, then quietly disappear until the next day. David had begun to look forward to the old soldier's daily appearances. There was something deeply moving about his dedication, his unwavering commitment to what seemed like a personal ritual of respect. Other guards had noticed him too. They had started referring to him among themselves as the Colonel, though none of them knew his actual name or rank. On this snowy morning, however, something was different. The old man's usual steady posture seemed more labored, and David could see him swaying slightly against the wind. His breathing created small clouds in the frigid air, and his face appeared paler than usual. David felt a growing concern that the elderly veteran might be pushing himself beyond his physical limits. As the morning progressed, David watched with increasing alarm as the old man began to struggle more noticeably. Several times he seemed to lose his balance momentarily before steadying himself against the palace railings. Passersby offered him assistance, but he politely declined each gesture. Determined to maintain his vigil despite his obvious discomfort, around 11:30, disaster struck. The old man suddenly collapsed to his knees in the snow, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. David abandoned his post without hesitation, rushing to the fallen veteran's side. He knelt beside him in the slush, his pristine uniform forgotten as he focused solely on providing aid to someone clearly in distress. The old man looked up at David with eyes that held both gratitude and determination. In a voice weakened by age and effort, he introduced himself as Colonel William Harrison, retired from the Coldstream Guards after 45 years of service. He explained that he had been coming to the palace every day because he was dying, and he wanted to pay his respects one final time to the institution he had served with such devotion. Colonel Harrison revealed that he had been diagnosed with terminal cancer 3 months earlier. The doctors had given him perhaps weeks to live, but he was determined to complete what he called his final duty tour. He had served in conflicts around the world, protecting British interests and representing the crown with honor. Now, as his life drew to a close, he felt compelled to return to where it all began. To stand guard one last time in service to his queen and country, David helped the colonel to a nearby bench, wrapping his own military greatcoat around the shivering man's shoulders. He called for medical assistance while staying by the veteran's side, listening as the older man shared stories from his decades of service. Colonel Harrison spoke of distant battlefields, of friends lost and causes defended, of the pride he felt every time he wore the uniform that now hung loose on his diminished frame. As the ambulance arrived, Colonel Harrison gripped David's hand with surprising strength. He asked if David would help him complete his final salute to the palace. Despite the protests of the paramedics, David assisted the dying man to his feet one last time. Together, they faced the palace gates. 2 generations of guardsmen united in their shared commitment to duty and service. Colonel Harrison's final salute was perfect in its execution, despite his physical frailty. His arm rose steadily, his shoulders squared with the muscle memory of a lifetime spent in uniform. David saluted alongside him, creating a moment of profound connection that transcended rank, age, and circumstance. For 30 seconds that felt like an eternity, 2 soldiers stood as one, Honoring the institution they both served, the colonel was taken to hospital that afternoon, where he passed away peacefully 2 days later. His family revealed that he had specifically requested to spend his final days visiting the palace, fulfilling what he saw as his last military obligation. They thanked David for his kindness and for helping their father complete his final mission with dignity and honor. At Colonel Harrison's funeral, David served as an honor guard, standing at attention as the old soldier was laid to rest with full military honors. The colonel's family presented David with one of the Veterans Service Medals, asking him to carry forward the legacy of dedication and service that had defined the older man's life. David returned to his duties with a renewed sense of purpose. He understood more clearly that his role as a guardian was part of an unbroken chain of service stretching back through generations. Every day at his post, he remembered Colonel Harrison's final salute and the reminder that duty, honor, and service are values that transcend individual lives, connecting past, present, and future in an eternal commitment to something greater than oneself. The bench where David had comforted the dying colonel became a place of quiet reflection for the palace guards. They would often pause there during breaks, remembering the lesson taught by an old soldier's determination to serve until his very last breath. Christmas Eve at Buckingham Palace carried a special magic that even the most disciplined guards could feel. Guardsman Michael O'Brien stood at his post as gentle snowflakes drifted down from the dark London sky, each one catching the warm glow of the palace's holiday lights. The usual crowds of tourists had thinned to a few families taking evening strolls, their children's excited whispers about Father Christmas floating on the crisp winter air. Michael had volunteered for the Christmas Eve duty, allowing his colleagues with young families to spend the holiday at home. At 25 and unmarried, he figured the overtime pay would help him save for the engagement ring he planned to buy for his girlfriend, Emma. Besides, he found something peaceful about the quiet dignity of guarding the palace during such a holy night. As the evening deepened, Michael noticed a small commotion near the palace gates. A young mother was kneeling beside a girl who appeared to be about 6 years old. The child was crying softly while the mother spoke to her in hushed, urgent tones. Even from his position, Michael could see the distress in both their faces, as they seemed to be having some sort of disagreement. The woman approached one of the other tourists, asking something Michael couldn't quite hear. The stranger shook his head apologetically and walked away. The mother tried several more people, each interaction ending the same way. Her desperation was becoming more apparent with each rejection, and her daughter's tears were flowing more freely. Finally, the woman mustered the courage to approach Michael's post. She was clearly hesitant to disturb a guard on duty, but her maternal concern had overcome her reluctance. In a voice thick with emotion, she explained that her daughter Lucy had been battling a rare form of childhood cancer for the past year. The treatments had been brutal, and Lucy had lost all her hair, requiring her to wear a knitted cap that she hated because it made her feel different from other children. The mother, Helen, continued her story with tears gathering in her eyes. Lucy's greatest wish was to meet a real Queen's Guard and tell him about how she pretended to be a brave soldier during her hospital treatments. The doctors had recently delivered devastating news. Lucy's cancer was not responding to treatment, and they estimated she had perhaps weeks to live. Helen had brought her daughter to the palace on Christmas Eve, hoping to fulfill this one simple wish. Helen had been asking other tourists if they would take a photo of Lucy with the guard in the background, but everyone seemed too busy or uncomfortable with the request. She apologized profusely to Michael for bothering him, explaining that she knew he couldn't break protocol, but wondered if it would be acceptable for Lucy to simply stand near his post for a photograph. Michael's heart broke as he looked down at the small girl. Despite her illness, Lucy's eyes sparkled with curiosity and wonder as she gazed up at his tall bearskin hat and bright red tunic. She whispered to her mother, asking if the guard was one of the Queen's special protectors she had read about in her storybooks. When Helen confirmed this, Lucy's face lit up with the kind of pure joy that only children possess. Standing rigidly at attention, Michael faced a profound moral dilemma. His training demanded absolute stillness and silence during his duty, Breaking these rules could result in severe disciplinary action or even dismissal from the guard. But as he watched, his dying child's wonder and hope, military regulations seemed insignificant compared to the power of human compassion. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Michael allowed his gaze to drift downward. Until his eyes met Lucy's, he gave her the slightest smile, just a tiny upturn of his lips that would be invisible to most observers, but unmistakable to a child looking for connection. Lucy gasped with delight and grabbed her mother's hand, pointing excitedly at the guard who had acknowledged her presence. But Michael wasn't finished. As Helen fumbled with her phone to capture the moment, Michael made a decision that would risk his career but honor his humanity. He reached into his uniform pocket and retrieved something he always carried, a small metal button that had fallen from his tunic during a previous ceremony. It was regulation issue, bearing the royal crest, and completely worthless to most people, but priceless to a little girl who dreamed of being brave. With movements so subtle, they appeared accidental. Michael allowed the button to slip from his gloved fingers. It landed silently in the snow near Lucy's feet. The child looked down in amazement, then back up at Michael with wide eyes. He gave her another almost invisible nod, and Lucy understood this was a gift meant specifically for her. Lucy picked up the button with reverent care, holding it like the treasure it represented to her young heart. She whispered thank you so softly only her mother could hear. But Michael saw her lips form the words and felt his own eyes grow moist with unshed tears. Helen managed to capture several photos of Lucy holding her precious gift, her face glowing with happiness despite the difficult journey that lay ahead, as they prepared to leave. Lucy surprised everyone by standing at attention and rendering a perfect military salute to Michael. Her small hand was steady and precise, mimicking what she had seen in movies and picture books. The gesture was so touching that several other visitors stopped to watch. Sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary, Michael held his position until Lucy and her mother disappeared into the snowy London night, then allowed himself a moment to process what had just occurred. He had given a dying child a memory that would shine brightly during her darkest hours, and in return, she had reminded him why service to others was the highest calling any person could answer. Lucy lived for 2 more months, and according to her mother's later letter to the palace, she carried that button with her everywhere, telling everyone about the brave Queen's Guard who had given her a piece of his armor. When she passed away, she was buried with the button clutched in her small hands, taking with her a tangible symbol of the kindness that exists in the world. Michael never faced disciplinary action for his Christmas Eve gift. His commanding officer, upon learning the full story, quietly commended him for upholding the finest traditions of the Guard protection, service, and compassion for those who needed it most. The crisp autumn morning brought with it an unusual sight that caught the attention of guardsman James Peterson, as he took his position outside the Tower of London. Among the early tourists and school groups, an elderly man in a wheelchair was being pushed slowly along the ancient stone pathways by a middle-aged woman who appeared to be his daughter. What made this visitor different from the thousands of others who came too? See, the crown jewels was the way he stared at the yeoman warders and guards with an intensity that spoke of personal connection rather than mere curiosity. James had been stationed at the tower for 18 months, long enough to recognize the different types of visitors who came to this historic fortress. There were the excited families with cameras, the history enthusiasts with guidebooks, the respectful veterans who moved with a certain bearing that marked them as former military. This man belonged to the latter category. But there was something more, a deep sadness that seemed to weigh on his shoulders despite the warm autumn sunshine. The man's daughter wheeled him closer to James's post, and he could see more clearly the visitor's condition. The elderly gentleman appeared to be in his 70s, his body ravaged by what looked like the effects of a stroke. His left side was partially paralyzed, and he struggled to form words clearly, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. Those eyes held stories of service, sacrifice, and experiences that younger generations could barely imagine. During a brief lull in foot traffic, the daughter approached James hesitantly. She introduced herself as Catherine Williams and explained that her father, Robert, had served as a yeoman warder at the Tower of London for 23 years before retiring in 1995. He suffered a severe stroke 6 months earlier, and the doctors weren't optimistic about his recovery. This was likely to be his final visit to the place that had been more than just his workplace. It had been his home, his pride, and his identity. Catherine went on to explain that her father had been growing increasingly agitated in recent weeks, trying to communicate something important but unable to express it clearly due to his speech difficulties. After much patience and careful listening, she had finally understood that he desperately wanted to return to the tower one last time. He wanted to see his old post, to stand where he had served with such dedication, and to say goodbye to the ravens he had helped care for during his tenure. Robert had joined the yeoman warders, known affectionately as beefeaters, after completing 22 years of military service. Like all warders, he had been required to hold the rank of sergeant major or above and possess an unblemished service record. For Robert, becoming a yeoman warder had been the perfect culmination of a career spent serving his country. He had lived in one of the tower's ancient quarters with his late wife, Margaret, and their young daughter, Catherine. The tower had been Catherine's playground and classroom during her childhood. She remembered her father's pride as he led tours, sharing the tower's bloody and fascinating history with visitors from around the world. He knew every stone, every story, every legend associated with the ancient fortress. The ravens, those mystical guardians whose presence was said to protect the kingdom, had been his special responsibility, and he had formed genuine bonds with each generation of birds during his service. Margaret had passed away just 2 years after Robert's retirement, and he had struggled with the loss of both his wife and his purpose. The stroke had been the cruel final blow, robbing him of his ability to communicate the stories and knowledge that had defined his life. Catherine could see her father fading away, not just physically, but spiritually, as he became trapped within a body and mind that could no longer express the wealth of experience he carried. James listened to this story with growing emotion. He understood the profound connection between a person and their place of service, the way duty and location could become intertwined with identity itself. He could see Robert straining to communicate something, his good hand gesturing weakly toward different parts of the tower complex, his eyes pleading for understanding, making a decision that could have serious consequences for his own career. James quietly radioed his supervisor and explained the situation. What happened next demonstrated the compassion and respect that existed within the ranks of those who served at this historic site. Within minutes, the chief yeoman warder himself appeared. Having recognized Robert's name and remembered his exemplary service record, what followed was an impromptu ceremony that brought tears to everyone present. Current yeoman warders, who had served alongside Robert, emerged from their duties to welcome their old colleague home. They wheeled his chair through areas normally restricted to tourists, allowing him to see his former quarters and the places where he had spent the happiest years of his working life. The most emotional moment came when they brought Robert to see the ravens. As soon as the ancient birds saw the familiar figure, several of them approached his wheelchair with what could only be described as recognition. One particularly bold raven, a descendant of birds Robert had once cared for, actually perched on the arm of his wheelchair and remained there for several minutes. As if paying respects to an old friend, for the first time since his stroke, Robert managed to speak clearly. With tremendous effort, he whispered the traditional yeoman warder motto, "Faithful and true." The words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of a lifetime's dedication to service. Every guard and warder present understood the significance of that moment, a dying man's final affirmation of the values that had guided his entire adult life. The visit lasted 3 hours, far longer than Catherine had expected. Her father's spirits visibly lifted as he reconnected with his past and received the honor and recognition he deserved from those who understood his sacrifice. When they finally prepared to leave, Robert managed one final salute to his fellow guardians, a gesture that was immediately returned by every man present. Robert passed away peacefully in his sleep just 2 weeks later. At his funeral, the tower's current yeoman warders served as pallbearers, and one of the tower's ravens was brought to the service in an unprecedented tribute. Catherine later donated her father's medals and uniform to the Tower's museum, ensuring that future visitors would learn about the dedication of men like Robert Williams, who had devoted their lives to protecting Britain's heritage. The spring morning at Horse Guards. Colruyt buzzed with unusual activity as Guardsman Andrew Foster prepared for what promised to be a challenging day. A special school group was scheduled to visit 20 children from St. Mary's School for the Deaf, ranging in age from 7 to 12 years old. Their teacher, Miss Emma Richardson, had arranged this educational trip to help her students learn about British history and traditions. Despite the unique communication challenges they faced, Andrew had been briefed about the visiting group and felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. He had never interacted with deaf children before and wasn't sure how to handle the situation while maintaining his duties. The children's silence would be different from the usual quiet respect shown by most school groups. This would be the profound silence of those who lived in a world without sound, yet somehow seemed to notice everything with remarkable intensity. As the bright yellow school bus pulled up to the historic parade ground, Andrew watched 20 pairs of curious eyes peer through the windows at the magnificent horses and uniformed guards. The children's faces showed the same wonder he was accustomed to seeing in young visitors. But their communication was entirely different. Their hands moved in rapid, graceful gestures as they signed excitedly to each other about what they were seeing. Miss Richardson gathered her students around her, using sign language to explain the historical significance of the location and the role of the household cavalry. Andrew was fascinated by the way the children's attention never wavered. They watched their teacher's hands with complete focus, occasionally signing questions or comments that she answered with patient clarity. Their world might lack sound. It was clearly rich with communication and understanding. One particular student caught Andrew's attention immediately. A small boy named Oliver, perhaps 8 years old, stood slightly apart from the group, his eyes fixed on Andrew with an intensity that was both curious and somehow challenging, while the other children focused on Miss Richardson's explanations. Oliver seemed more interested in studying the guard himself, the way he stood, the details of his uniform, the discipline required to remain perfectly still despite the distractions around him. As the group moved closer to Andrew's post, he could see Oliver signing rapidly to his teacher. Miss Richardson listened to his questions and then approached Andrew's position, speaking aloud while simultaneously translating into sign language for her students. She explained that Oliver wanted to know if being a guard was lonely, standing so still and quiet all the time. The question struck Andrew as remarkably perceptive for such a young child. Miss Richardson went on to share Oliver's story with Andrew, speaking quietly so the other children couldn't hear. Oliver had been born deaf and had struggled with feelings of isolation and difference throughout his young life. He often felt like he was trapped in silence while the world moved around him. When he learned about the Queen's Guard, he became fascinated by the idea of people whose job required them to be silent and still. Wondering if they understood something about his own experience, the boy had spent weeks preparing for this visit, reading every book about the royal guards that the school library contained. He had practiced standing at attention in front of his bedroom mirror, timing himself to see how long he could remain perfectly motionless. In Oliver's mind, the guards were not just ceremonial figures, they were people who had mastered the art of meaningful silence, something he felt he understood better than most. As Andrew listened to this explanation, he felt a profound connection to the small boy whose experience was so different from his own, yet somehow parallel. Oliver lived in enforced silence, while Andrew chose periods of ceremonial silence as part of his duty. The boy's fascination wasn't just with the pageantry and tradition, it was with finding others who understood the power and purpose that could exist within quietness. During the educational presentation that followed, Andrew watched as Oliver continued to study him intently. The boy seemed to be conducting his own private lesson, serving how a person could communicate strength, dignity, and presence without words or sounds. Andrew found himself making subtle adjustments to his posture and bearing, unconsciously trying to be the best example possible for this young observer who was learning about more than just military traditions. When the official presentation ended and the group prepared to leave, Oliver broke away from his classmates and approached Andrew's post one final time. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present as one of the most touching moments in the history of Horse Guards parade. The small boy stood directly in front of Andrew and slowly, deliberately, came to attention in a perfect military pose. Oliver's stance was remarkably accurate for someone who had never received formal training. His back was straight, his feet positioned correctly, his arms at his sides with just the right angle. But most impressive was his face, serious, focused, and filled with a dignity that transcended his young years. For a full minute, guard and child stood in matching silence. Two figures united in their understanding of what it meant to communicate through stillness and discipline. The moment was broken when Oliver stepped forward and, using sign language, spelled out a message that Miss Richardson translated for the gathered adults. "Thank you for showing me that being quiet can be strong." The simplicity and profundity of this statement moved several observers to tears, including seasoned guards who had witnessed countless ceremonies and events. Andrew, still maintaining his official position, managed the slightest nod of acknowledgement, a gesture so small that only Oliver noticed it, but one that meant everything to a boy who had spent his life learning to read the subtlest forms of communication. In that tiny movement, Oliver found validation that his own experience of navigating a quiet world had value and meaning. The school group returned to their bus amid excited signing about everything they had learned. But Oliver walked more slowly, processing an experience that had given him a new perspective on his own life. Miss Richardson later wrote to the palace, explaining how the visit had transformed not just Oliver but several of her students, showing them that there were many different ways to be strong, and that their silence didn't make them less valuable or capable. Andrew continued his duties that day with a heightened awareness of the different types of communication happening around him, the spoken words of tourists, the visual signals between his fellow guards, and the profound conversations that could occur without any sound at all. Oliver had taught him that true understanding often happens in the spaces between words, in the careful observation of gesture and bearing, and in the recognition that strength comes in many forms. The summer heat shimmered off the pavement outside. Clarence House's guardsman Daniel Clark adjusted his collar for what he knew would be a sweltering day of duty. The unusual warmth had drawn larger crowds than typical, with tourists seeking shade near the building's walls and guards struggling to maintain their composure under the weight of their heavy uniforms. Despite the physical discomfort, Daniel took pride in his assignment. Protecting a residence with such deep historical significance required the utmost professionalism. Among the usual mix of tourists and passers-by, Daniel noticed a middle-aged woman sitting alone on a nearby bench. She had been there since early morning, occasionally glancing toward his position, but mostly staring at a small photograph she held in her trembling hands. Unlike the constant stream of visitors who came and went, this woman seemed anchored to her spot, as if leaving would somehow break an invisible connection she desperately needed to maintain. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Daniel's concern for the woman grew. She appeared to be in her 50s, well-dressed but showing signs of emotional distress. Her eyes were red from crying. She occasionally wiped away fresh tears while gazing at whatever image the photograph contained. Several times she seemed to gather courage to approach the building, only to hesitate and return to her bench with obvious disappointment. During the changing of the guard ceremony, when Daniel's attention was momentarily focused on the precise movements of the ritual, he heard a soft voice calling his name. The woman had finally approached his post and was speaking in barely audible tones. Clearly nervous about disturbing an active duty guard, she introduced herself as Patricia Hawkins and apologized profusely for the interruption. Explaining that she had traveled from Scotland specifically to fulfill a promise she had made to her late husband, Patricia's story unfolded slowly, punctuated by tears and long pauses as she struggled with the emotions that brought her to London. Her husband, Robert, had served as a guard at various royal residences during the 1980s, before leaving the military to start a family. Their marriage had been blessed with 40 happy years together, during which Robert often spoke fondly of his time in service to the crown, describing it as the most meaningful period of his life. Robert had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease 3 years earlier, and Patricia had watched helplessly as the man she loved gradually disappeared behind the cruel fog of memory loss. During his lucid moments, which became increasingly rare, Robert would often talk about wanting to return to his old posts one final time. He wanted to stand where he had once served with such pride, to remember who he had been during those years of purpose and dedication. Patricia had promised her husband that when the time was right, she would bring him back to London for that final visit. She had researched his service records and identified the locations where he had been stationed, planning an elaborate journey that would allow Robert to reconnect with his past. But as often happens with cruel diseases, time ran out before promises could be kept. Robert had passed away 2 months earlier, never having made the trip that meant so much to him. Now Patricia found herself alone, carrying the weight of an unfulfilled promise and her own crushing grief. She had come to London anyway, determined to honor her husband's memory by visiting the places that had shaped him as a young man. The photograph she clutched showed Robert in his guard uniform from 1983. Standing proudly at this very location where Daniel now served, she wanted to complete the journey Robert never could, to stand where he once stood and remember him as the dedicated soldier he had been. The emotional weight of Patricia's story affected Daniel deeply. He could see the profound love she had held for her husband and the guilt she carried over being unable to fulfill her final promise to him. Patricia explained that she had been sitting on the bench for hours, trying to find the courage to approach the building where Robert had once worked. She felt lost and uncertain about how to honor his memory properly, especially since she was now alone in a city that held significance for him but felt foreign and intimidating too. Daniel made a decision that went far beyond his official duties. During his next scheduled break, he approached Patricia and offered to help her complete the journey she had begun for her husband's sake. He explained the history of the building where Robert had served and shared what he knew about the duties and traditions that would have been part of Robert's daily routine during his time in service. With Patricia's permission, Daniel escorted her to various vantage points around the building, helping her understand the layout and significance of different areas. He pointed out architectural details that Robert would have seen every day and explained how the guard rotations worked, giving Patricia insights into what her husband's daily experience would have been like during his service. The most meaningful moment came when Daniel helped Patricia place a small bouquet of flowers at a spot near where her husband's old post would have been located. The flowers were roses from their garden in Scotland, the same type Robert had planted for her on their wedding day 40 years earlier. As Patricia laid the bouquet down, she whispered words of love and forgiveness to her absent husband, finally releasing the guilt she carried over the promise she couldn't keep. Daniel stood at respectful attention while Patricia said her private goodbye to Robert's memory. Other tourists and guards who witnessed the scene maintained a reverent silence, understanding instinctively that they were observing something sacred and deeply personal. The moment transcended the usual boundaries between duty and compassion, creating a space where human connection took precedence over protocol. Before leaving London, Patricia wrote a letter to Daniel's commanding officer, praising the young guard's kindness and professionalism. She explained how his compassion had helped her transform a journey of guilt and sorrow into one of healing and closure. The act of completing Robert's intended pilgrimage had allowed her to feel connected to her husband's memory while also finding the strength to begin moving forward with her own life. Daniel received a commendation for his actions, but the real reward was the knowledge that he had helped someone find peace during one of the most difficult periods of her life. Patricia's visit reminded him that his role as a guard extended beyond protecting buildings and maintaining ceremonies. Sometimes the most important service was simply being present for someone who needed to feel that their story mattered. Patricia returned to Scotland, transformed by her London experience. She established a small scholarship fund in Robert's name to help young people pursue military careers, ensuring that her husband's dedication to service would continue to inspire future generations. Each year on the anniversary of Robert's death, she sent flowers to be placed at Clarence's house, maintaining her connection to the place where their love story had found its peaceful conclusion.